Good afternoon. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining into this session. My name's Oscar Clark. I am Chief Strategy Officer at Fundamentally Games. We're a living game publisher, but I'm also quite well known for having been around in the games industry for quite a long time. I have a confession to make. I am a properly trained marketeer too. I actually am a DIPM, MCIM, so I have got a history of looking at marketing and marketing communications. I just happened to fall into the games industry in 1998 and ended up not just sort of marketing and promoting games, but also involved in game design. And at the moment, I spend a lot of time talking and helping game developers thinking about the implications, not just of sort of playability, but how they target audiences, how they engage with audiences, how they make better and longer term retention experiences. Part of that is also to tell other people who maybe aren't in the games industry a little bit about why games are so special. And I'm going to try and do that in the context of some changes that are happening in the games industry or have happened, but that particularly affect the advertising space. So I'm going to try and cover all those things off. In the meantime, if people have got questions, I think there's a submission thing I'm going to be trying to pay attention to. And I know the organisers will drop me messages if there's an issue that needs to be covered off. So please feel free to think about that. And I'll try and take questions at the end as well. So I've been around in games for about as long as it comes. I even wrote a book on the subject of games as a service. So hopefully in the sessions you've had today, or at least in your general understanding of games, you will know that games are big. I mean, when Newzoo are telling us that it's a $175.8 billion industry, we know it's pretty big. But actually, that's only the tip of the iceberg. That doesn't include all the hardware and all the kind of incidental revenues, which probably takes the games industry to about double. Now, to give you a bit of context, games is already bigger than movies, box office movies, and music combined. And in the pandemic, it's pretty much got to the point where it's basically as big as home entertainment and music combined. Now, think about that, what that means. So this growth, this change that's happened, particularly during the lockdown period, where games is now firmly established as probably the biggest, well, undoubtedly the biggest digital entertainment medium there is. So if you want to find audiences for your brands, for your entities, there is only one place to find them, and that is games. So, what does that mean? In terms of frequency of play, put it this way, 84% of people worldwide, based on a Hootsuite analysis of social media activity, play weekly. 84% of people. Now, you could say, oh, yeah, that's kids and so on and so on. No, that isn't just kids. This is split across where 2/3 of people 54 to 64, I'm not quite there yet. I know I'm looking old, but I'm not quite there yet. But 2/3 of 54 to 64-year-old people identify as gamers. Now, go back to the era when I grew up and games were new in the 80s. I know, I told you I was old. It was always spotty kids in the dark playing on their own with a computer. That's not the case anymore. Games are everybody. It is the most addressable, targetable place where you can find audiences and communicate to them in ways that are meaningful. In fact, that's a really interesting thing about games. Games are verbs. They are not passive. We do in games. And the opportunities that means for brands and experiences is deeper and more profound than any other platform. And I can't stress that enough. But obviously, I'm in a world which is a little bit more complicated than that. Obviously, we've got a bunch of conflicting opinions. We've got EA at one side saying they're not planning to put video ads into games, despite the fact they've just signed up with a platform that's offering TV-style ad formats in games stuff. And that's mostly about PC, admittedly. Mobile is very much embracing ads in all sorts of ways. I can talk about it in more detail. And in fact, so much so that when you ask people what they prefer, 51%, I can't quite read that on my screen, 51% are saying that they prefer to watch ads to play a mobile game for free. That so shows you the different kind of ranges of opinions and the importance that ads are placing, particularly in mobile, but not just in mobile. I think that we'll see some really interesting uses of promotional style material in all sorts of gaming experiences. But for those of you who've been living under a rock in the mobile space, you may not be aware, but so hopefully a lot of you will be, that when Apple produced the iOS 14.5, they took away what's called the IDFA, so the ID for advertisers. Now, what does that mean? What that means is there's now a step where you have to sign in, and there's a new process called SKAdNetwork and ATT, which is active. Actually, I forget the acronyms. The point is, there's lots of acronyms. There's now a barrier to getting somebody to see your advert that there wasn't before. And this is all related to data protection. So this isn't just out of the blue. This is part of a wider increase of the kind of reluctance to share private data and to be able to provide more protection for users. So it's not completely unreasonable. And there's been fallout. So when you look at the breakdown of how many people who have so far, this I think was taken from stats in July, you will probably find that there's basically around 20% of people who are basically signing and accepting. Now that may go up as people, it's a bit like the cookie problem. We've got to the stage where we're so blasé tapping yes to cookies, we're actually making ourselves, in my opinion, a little bit more at more risk than we would have been had we not had that, but that's another subject for another day. There has been a drop in revenue, particularly on iOS compared to Google. So I don't think, although that you could argue that graph on the right-hand side looks a little bit like the revenue that's gone from iOS has gone to Google, I'm not sure that's quite true. I think that there's general growth in Google as well. So I don't want to infer too much on that. I've had a little question here I'm going to respond to quickly. So do I see this move on IDFA being reversed in the future? Absolutely not. It's not going to happen. There's lots of reasons why. Partly because privacy and data protection demands will grow. I'm going to talk a little bit about something which came into force, I think, technically yesterday, which is the Children's Code, the AADC. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. We are going to see more concern over privacy. We're going to see more responses to that. And also, with Epic and Apple going through a battle about storefronts at the moment, there's been an argument posited by a friend of mine called Eric Suffert, who thinks that actually this SKAdNetwork approach, this removing IDFA, is actually something which will protect Apple's position as a storefront. So there is an inherent mechanism where I think the likelihood of it being reversed is very low. Hopefully that answered the question. So moving on, we're going to look a little bit about, well, so there are significant issues that also apply to re-engaging. Because if we're not able to track people as effectively, we can't re-engage those people and bring them back to our games or bring them back to our brand. So tracking people through different experiences is going to be somewhat difficult, but we'll get to that. So I mentioned I was going to talk about other schemes, particularly in the context of that question. So our age-appropriate design code is this new piece from the ICO. Actually, we're very lucky. We've got to work with some of the team at the ICO. They asked us to give them feedback on recommendations for game developers. I'm going to show you that. I'm not going to bore you with that in detail, but I just show you this is something we're thinking a lot about. And we'll then try to sort of bring back on that where I think that's going to affect people who are going to use games for advertising and how we can think about dealing with those consequences. So, so the question here, right-hand graph, revenue profile slide, not an absolute revenue slide. Yes, I think you're right. I was just trying to show something illustrative. So hopefully that answers that question. So what does the AADC cover? It covers all of these things. Don't worry, not going to go line by line. That would be a very, very boring talk. And as you hopefully I can tell, it wouldn't cover that off in 20 minutes. So what I want to sort of get you to think about is there's a 15 core standards that games, and actually this is not just games. Any experience, apps, websites, etc., are going to have to consider essentially the best interest of the child. That is a really key thing. Now you say, hang on a minute, advertising isn't targeted at children, it's all fine, isn't it? No, it's not. And I'll talk about why in a second. This is going to have much more profound effect because we now have to be absolutely sure that this user is not a child. We cannot just say we're not aiming to a child anymore. That's one of the key changes. DPIA is a type of assessment, data protection analysis, that we're going to have to do on the way we capture and store data. That has a direct knock-on effect on how we target and address audiences in advertising. So there's a whole bunch of things that go on. Transparency, age appropriateness, all these things are going to be interesting, particularly location, parental controls, all of these things are going to have knock-on effects in other areas. I'm not going to bore you all about the details. They won't apply to all of you in all circumstances. However, there's another question here, which I'm going to try and respond to. Mobile gaming groups have held off on spending on user acquisition costs due to disruption to the app marketing ecosystem. Do I see signs that, yet of that easing and advertisers building more confidence in the new normal? There has been a decline in ad revenue for games, and therefore that means ad spend by advertisers. It is a kind of, I don't want to say depressing because that sounds like it's sad. It's not sad. It's just that it has had a reduction effect overall to an extent, but we are still seeing. So, for example, I'm still doing Facebook tests of game concepts to see if that game is going to be viable. I'm still seeing similar KPIs. So what is my cost per install compared to how effective do I think that game is going to be? I'm still seeing very similar levels in terms of the actual cost per install. So from an advertiser point of view, the balance between the less competition and the access to the user changes seems to be relatively balancing out, but it is still slightly more expensive per user, if that makes sense. Anyway, so hopefully I've kind of answered some of those thoughts. So let's talk about what the implications of these things are. Now, what I'm going to talk about here is what is it in clearer terms. So this is a clarification of GDPR. This is not really brand new stuff. It's also an evolution. So we had COPA compliance, which is a big thing for the games industry, but I think for people generally, which was about the protection for children based out of the US, California in particular, because there was a variation of regulation in California. So the collection of personal data had to be considered much more carefully as a result of COPA compliance, so protection of children. GDPR obviously coming in 2018 made sure that we had to get people to opt in rather than opt out of promotional activities. So we have already had a lot of the extra elements needed. However, at the time, it was mostly we felt that we were okay if we were not targeting kids. What this does is change that so it becomes about, are children likely to use these services? And again, remember, this is not just games. This is about the use of data in the best interest of the child. We have to pay attention to the fact that there may be children using our games. As a result, we have to think about the way that we collect data and the implications that then has on the advertising market is therefore profound because of the tracking, the re-engagement, and all those other issues. It essentially magnifies the experience and the limitations that we've already experienced with GDPR. It's not the end of the world, but we have to make sure that we're dealing with inferred data carefully. So that's why I think it's a really key element to think about. Okay, so moving on. Game developers are going to have to think about mapping out all of the sources of data and the way they're handling and supporting data, and they need to communicate that. Most importantly, they have to show why they're using that data and get approval from the user to have that data collected. And if the user decides to remove that approval, they need to have that removable. There's a whole bunch of recommendations that we provided. That means, the personal data has to be, we have to make sure that the personal data is data which is attributable. If it is not attributable, if you can't reverse engineer it, that's okay, but you still have to communicate it. And you have to make sure you know what you're actually collecting. Again, really important to get those things. So these are the recommendations we've given to game developers. anyone's interested in getting access to the slides, I'm happy to share these. What does it mean to advertisers? So essentially what this means is that targeting and segmentation is going to be more difficult, particularly in games, but I think wider than just games. I think this is something we have to address generally. Retargeting users is going to be more difficult. Attribution is going to be more difficult. All of these things are, as I say, an extension of what's already happened to an extent with GDPR, but just taken to another level. So what can advertisers do? This is really the heart of what I wanted to talk about. So it's going to come down to, we're going to need to double down on creative design. We're going to have to rely more on the messaging and the visuals and the experience of our adverts to kind of self-define the audience and drive them to action. It's the classic awareness, interest, desire, action, although I'd add to that retention as well, but that's another subject for another conversation as well. You also have to understand how your game appears in games. So the closer you can work with game teams to understand how best for your advert, whether it's a brand ad or ad for another game, works in context of the game, the better. There are lots of different formats now, whether it's rewarded ads, in world ads, interstitials, banners obviously still exist. I hate banners, I hate them, but there are some games where it works. So the more you understand how these things work, the better. And the more you understand the layers of what's possible, the better. And with smart planning, and particularly where you target user interest groups, with an integrated campaign that actually uses multi-channel messaging, so social as well as game, as well as other applications, other platforms, other websites, and so on and so forth. As long as you've got that consistency, you will still find success in games because your audience are playing games. That's what we established at the beginning of the session. So focus on smaller volumes of asset delivery. Look at more implicit audience relevance, and basically watch out for what's happening with the emerging adaptation by the ad platforms themselves. As per the previous question, we are seeing changes. This is early days of these rules, and GDPR and IDFA and AADC are all going to affect, and they're going to continue to affect us. But what we have to do is basically pay attention to what the ad companies are already doing, and basically get to know your local game developer and see how they can work with you to make sure that your games can be more effective, not just in that game, but your ads can be effective across multiple games. So that's me. If you're interested in what we do as Fundamentally Games, we're a living game publisher. So that means we're interested in games that are sustainable. We tend to use more hybrid monetization models, so that means in-app purchases as well as ads, and I can bore you forever on those kind of things. Questions are here. What makes users more likely to approve personal data? Well, that's a difficult one. I think when they understand the value to them, and I think that's something where it's really important to engage with the gaming teams, so that if they can find ways so that we're smarter in the way that we communicate and we set up context so the ads are valuable. One of the powerful tools is rewarded ads. I was the evangelist for one of the earliest teams doing that, Unity Ads, back in the day. And we found that design integration with communication and messaging for ads was really powerful. And if you can think about working closer with game teams to understand how best to do that, it won't just benefit you for an individual game, as I said, but multiple games, and also I think in multiple applications. So hopefully that makes sense. Will in-app purchases help solve some of the issues for games? Absolutely. And of course, in-app purchases can be more than just in digital assets for the game. It could potentially be digital assets for other things. Now, that's a bit more complicated because of some of the rules of the app stores, particularly Apple. But with the Apple and Epic legal battles over stores, there's talk that Apple may be required to allow people to signpost to other stores, and therefore that could unlock a unprecedented set of opportunities for very smart advertising that drives users to direct purchases outside of the game, within the game, if that makes sense. Cool. And in-app purchase is easy to track? Yes, because I have made the decision to opt into buying something. Therefore, it's easy to track from an operational point of view. We can still abstract the information about the player identity. And one of the key design issues that we do with data collection is to make sure that telemetry, so gameplay data, is separate from personal purchasing behavior data. But yeah, the trouble is, of course, if you're purchasing, that's identifiable. But yeah, it's still an emerging area, basically. I'm not sure if that really answered that question. So I've rattled through that rapidly like a machine gun. I apologize if it was too fast for everybody. Please feel free to reach out to me. You can get me at hi@fundamentally.games. I'm also at Athanasius, so ATHANATEUS. I know it's a terrible Twitter handle, but it has a long history and of why I have it. I won't bore you with the details, but please just Google me, Oscar Clark Games. You'll find me very easily. So unless anyone's got any additional questions, I think that's me running out of time. And I think I was basically pretty much on time, hopefully. Oh, one last question. Am I allowed to answer that one? I'll ask the mysterious voice. So the mysterious voice has told me I can. In-game mobile ads are so powerful for other mobile game groups. Why would they ever be outbid for slots by other brands? The reason is it's the revenue per action. So, for example, the cost per install that can be managed, if you, for example, are doing a car test drive, the CPI for that could be up to like 250 quid and still be viable for certain makes of car. So, in that circumstance, the specifics of that product can make sense for them to outbid any realistic mobile game brand. The margins on games are generally very small. We can't afford for CPIs to be more than, say, 40 cents, 50 pence. Some longer term games can be higher, but typically you want to keep them low. And I'm going to stick another one. Glad I mentioned Epic Apple Battle. The option for brand commerce in games is now nascent. How do I see this growing? So I think we've been held back by both Android and Apple in terms of the ability to be able to unlock new stores and new opportunities, not because they're intentionally blocking things, but they're trying to protect their businesses. I think this opens up opportunities. However, because of the data capture restrictions, we may still find there limitations on the ability for third-party stores to be able to be effective. So it's going to be stores which are cross-platform. It's going to be stores which have their own inherent brand identity and their own inherent momentum, where audiences already trust them, that you're going to see being effective, in my opinion. But Amazon tried to do app stores on Android, and that was not successful for a lot of things. It did work for their Fire games, but not for other devices. So it's an interesting space. I think that's me done. Well, hopefully that was useful to you. Please feel free to keep in touch, and I'll hand over to the organisers.